Good morning, everybody. My name is Hassan Ali. I am the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Economic Research Forum, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. And first of all, I would like genuinely to thank our host, the University of Mohammed Sadis is really a wonderful host. ERF is glad that we are in Morocco, and it's about time to basically extend our wings to our regions. ERF as a think tank have a lot to offer, and we are very, very proud of this cooperation with the North African star country, which is Morocco. I'm also happy to welcome my colleagues who's going to be on this panel giving you welcome and remark. Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi is well known and he needs no introduction. He is the managing director of ERF. Among his previous task was Minister of Finance and Economic Planning for Sudan. He has been also faculty member in a major university in Sudan. He has a PhD from North Carolina, if I remember correctly. But what I remember a lot about Dr. Ibrahim, that he is a basketball I don't think player, but he is a basketball fan. So, Dr. Karim Al-Annawi is the Executive Vice President of Mohammed Sadis Polytech University, and he is the Dean of the Humanity, Economics, and Social Science Division. He spent about 7 years working in the Central Bank of Morocco, different department, and about 8 years at the World Bank. He is prolific in research. He held various positions as an advisory in the national and international organization, and he has a PhD from Bordeaux in France. Our third guest is Mr. Abdelrahim Bouazzeh. He is the General Director of Bank al-Maghrib, the Central Bank of Morocco. He served in many capacities and led several important divisions inside the bank. In 2014, he was appointed as advisor to the governor of the bank. And he also became a CEO of Morocco company for the management of deposit committee fund. He is most likely the one that you need to ask whenever you have any question about the Central Bank of Morocco. We're very happy to have them on this panel, and I'm gonna do my opening remark and then let Dr. Ibrahim take the floor, and then Dr. Karim, and then Mr. Abdelrahim. Let me say that in this year, we are inaugurating the ERF 30th annual conference. So ERF is becoming really a young man. 30 is probably what used to be 15 in the old age. Life expectancy has increased, and ERF is becoming meaningful youth, really maturing enough to participate in the labor force. This is what we are doing here. We are participating in every activity that we think is going to build capacity. ERF has played an instrumental role for a long period of time now in building capacity and advising policy in the Middle East, specifically the Arab country, Iran and Turkey. ERF has continued to uphold its commitment to fostering insightful research, promoting informed dialogue, and driving impactful change in our region. And there is no more need for such activity than these days. If you, my research fellow, read the IMF economic outlook, you know that we are in a very dire need for such important help in terms of direction. Our dedicated team of researchers and collaborators have worked tirelessly to produce cutting-edge analysis, policy recommendation, and most importantly, data collection and development have significantly contributed to shaping the discourse on the key issue affecting our region. We have in the ERF, despite the uncertainty and disruption brought about by the global events, and everybody knows that lately things are becoming even more serious, ERF has remained steadfast in the mission to provide evidence-based insight and the strategic guidance to policymakers. We look ahead for the coming years. As ERF turns 30, I am confident that ERF will be well positioned to continue making a meaningful impact through our research initiative, collaborative partnership, and advocacy effort. With a real sense of purpose and commitment, we are poised to tackle emerging new issues and new problems like Gaza reconstruction and rebuilding, hopefully soon. How we may contribute to these positive changes will benefit not only our region, but the global economic and social peaceful landscape. One of the things that I would like to do is to express my gratitude to all of our affiliates for their unwavering dedication, passion, and contribution toward advancing our mission in the ERF. Particularly, I would like to thank our donors and partners throughout the years. The IDRC, International Development Research Center, is on the top with the Arab Fund for Economic and Development and Social Development. We have Ford Foundation, the World Bank. Also gratitude extend to the African Economic Research Consortium, the Agency Française de Développement, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the European Commission, the ILO, the UNDP, the UNICEF, and all the alphabet soup of UN institution. Our research fellow are our equipment, our building, our stakeholder, everything is our research fellow. With the collective effort of the research fellow, we have been instrumental in shaping our success and enforcing our reputation as a trusted source of expertise in the economic and financial matters. My gratitude is to my board of trustees, devotion and guidance. Also, I would like to recognize the advisory committee, the management and the staff of the ERF for their exemplary dedication and diligence. As ERF turns 30, I'm keen to honor and recognize all the distinguished members of the ERF network, and of course the managing director for their outstanding list that has been most insightful. Particularly, I would like to express my gratitude to the founder and the builder of this institution, ERF founder and first managing director, my dear friend, Dr. Heba Handousa. I think she is around. Also, the inaugural chairman of the board, my friend, Dr. Samir Maqdisi. Samir is here. He is the longest serving standing chairman of the ERF. And of course, nobody would ever dare to forget our own Mr. Abdul Latif Al-Hamad for providing visionary leadership and unwavering commitment to ERF. I would like special thanks to Mr. Abdul Latif Al-Hamad, please. It's with pride and on behalf of the ERF Board of Trustees Network and Secretariat, I acknowledge the institutional role played by ERF during the establishment and until this day, in terms of identifying the regional expertise, building the capacity, coordinating research, facilitating timely management of all the project that has been done by ERF. I am certain ERF has the potential and it is well positioned to best serve the region effectively and efficiently in the coming years under the leadership of Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi and his dedicated management team. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim and the ERF team. The floor of yours, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, our capable and visionary chairperson of the board, and also the members of the board, advisory committee, and our research fellows. I would like to start by really extending our deep thanks and appreciation to Dr. Karim Al-Annawi and his staff and colleagues at the Center for the New Policy Center for the New South for their cooperation and partnership with us and hosting us in this beautiful campus. And we think of this partnership as a starter. And we very much hope that this will lead into deeper and more elaborate partnership as we charter a new era of institutional cooperation within Africa and the Middle East and within the Global South as well. So I would like to start actually by reflecting on the theme of this conference. This conference is under the theme Tragedies of Regional Conflicts and Prospects of Peace Building, Responding to Disruptors, Enablers of MENA Development Pathway. The ERF will continue, obviously, with the basic programs as outlined by our chairman, particularly building databases, deploying the databases in order to promote evidence-based research, and reinventing and contributing to new modalities of dissemination and outreach to deploy this knowledge and engage stakeholders in our region, researchers, policymakers, and civil society institutions. This will be continue to be the bread and butter of our institution. And we will continue to focus on the very important mainstream issues like labor market, poverty, social welfare issues, and macroeconomics and so on. But then it is very important for us also to be cognizant of the changing environment around us. In particular, the issues that are exposed by this plenary. We think of these plenaries and this conference as a stepping stone to build much deeper research on new emerging issues as we continue, of course, to enhance our capacity and our relevance to the main development policy issues. The first one, really, and the most important one, is the intergenerational Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially in the aftermath of the war in Gaza. We should think of it as an intergenerational impediment to regional development and cooperation. We should think of the situation now as the cost of occupation on the Palestinian welfare as a society and as people, as an institution. We should also think about the prospects. These are the challenges, but we should think about the prospects in terms of the two-state solution and Palestinian independence as a pathway for peace and stability and cooperation in the region. But the way we will approach this, and this is very important to stress, we'll approach this from our comparative advantage as a research network. We are not policy advocates. We are not in the business of policy advocates or aggressive attitudes in terms of journalism. We know emotions are very high, but we should stay with our comparative advantage, not shy from addressing sensitive issues in as much as it affects development and welfare of our society at large, but we do it from our comparative advantage as research network. So this is a very important topic that obviously we will be introduced to it by a very capable keynote speaker and also very distinguished panelist. But this, as I said, is a stepping stone to actually promote systematic research on this area and to build a research network, sub-network of Palestinian economists and non-Palestinian economists and social scientists. The other issue is the country-specific conflicts in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, especially in socially fractionalized societies. You know, both the African flank of the Arab world as well as the Asian flank are reeling under the aftermath of the Arab Spring in terms of the near state collapse and conflicts. This is another imperative, important issue that we need to take into account, because all of these affect the ultimate development goals in the context of the SDGs and debt. And I should say that the World Bank, for example, recently produced a report on debt and conflict in the MENA region. And I think this is an important issue to connect why, for example, the region is going to miss the target big time of the SDGs as a result, obviously, of debt and external shocks, but very importantly, as a result of conflicts, especially conflicts in socially fractionalized societies. As we focus on these region-specific issues, we should also be concerned about global issues such as automation and artificial intelligence, climate change. And in this context, we at the ERF, we would be very much interested to build partnership with like-minded knowledge institutions such as the Policy Center for the New South, the African Economic Research Consortium, regional institutions like ESCOA, and so on, so that we can actually approach these global issues from a perspective of collective research effort, and also to build partnership with knowledge institutions that actually provide support and aid to our institutions, such as, of course, Ford Foundation, IDRC, World Bank, and of course the Arab Development, the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development, and many other actually partners that we have been engaging and in the context of our effort to broaden our partnership. The issue of relocalization and regional cooperation is a big issue that we have a plenary dedicated to it. In a shock-prone global economy, this also becomes an important issue that the ERF will be focusing on in the future. So let me say that actually the challenges are enormous, but also the prospects are there for us to realize. And we will continue the path that had brought us to where we are at the age of 30, but we will also be responding to these new challenges, and also to build partnership and opportunities. And this conference and this partnership with the Policy Center for the New South is a beginning for us to charter this road of partnership and cooperation. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of the conference and to enjoy the association and the get-together with our colleagues, because actually the annual conference is not only a flagship event for us to exchange ideas, but also to get to meet each other, and to build our social capital, bonding social capital, so to speak, within the region and beyond the region. Thank you very much.
Okay. Seems to be working. So good morning. Sabah al-khair. Welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me first thank Ibrahim personally and also ERF as an institution. Things happen because of institutions, but they happen mostly because of people. So history is made by people, not by institutions. So our choices impact what we are. So decisions are made and you decided to come here. So I'm glad that you are here with your team. Thanks to your team at ERF or your colleagues and also my colleagues at the Africa Institute for Research in Economics and Social Science at the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, which has been your counterpart in this project. The Policy Center acted more as this is where we got to know each other. So it's a good way to introduce things. You have to be a little bit deterministic for things to happen. They don't happen by itself, and you need also methods. I think method is essential, and this is what we do as scientists, academics. Being economists or social scientists, sociologists, psychologists, historians, philosophers, which I manage at university, more or less the same. We're all interested in inequality, in what we are, freedom, growth, the future. All what makes a difference is methods of science. And I think also we can have a discussion. There's convergence with the pervasive sort of spreading of technology in all disciplines. So discussions we often have here. So let me come. I want to say a few words about the context and how we see it from Morocco and here from where we sit. These are difficult times, challenging, of course, like always, full of opportunities, but still they are very sort of accurate and precise challenges to be dealt with by policymakers, and they're to think that ERF, like we do, is also interested in speaking through policymakers. So I think this is a specific type of skill that you need to decrypt, decode knowledge, science, for it to be used by decision makers. It requires specific skills, and that's what ERF was created 30 years, why ERF was created 30 years ago. So why do we need such an institution in between academia, I would say, and decision making? It's much needed, and I'll come back to that. In terms of the challenges, let me list a little bit some of them. You mentioned, Ibrahim, of course, conflict. We still have many countries in this region affected by conflict. But it's also macroeconomic management that is under pressure in most countries. And I see Marwan here, he won't deny that. Fiscal policy is under pressure. We've been sort of exhausting the margins of maneuver in many countries. The fiscal space has reduced due to shocks. Since 2007, 2008 financial crisis, the multiple shocks have affected this region. And you could see 2011, its consequences as one, but the pandemic, inflation, commodity price shocks, and a few others. So we are now in 2024 with the reduced fiscal space and in some country exchange rate risk, and I would say traditional macro stabilization challenges, balance of payment, pressures, parallel exchange rates, inflation, etc., etc. So I think it's already in our program, but this is really what keeps policymakers awake. Conflicts and shocks are mentioned, and there are structural, of course, challenges such as climate that is here. You take a country like Morocco, we've been suffering from water stress already. This year has been very serious. We got some rain, but this is very, very serious, and we're embarking in desalination programs, so it's impacted infrastructure. I could mention defense spending in most countries in this risky environment. Defense budgets have increased everywhere, and as we know, the fiscal space is not elastic to the infinitely elastic. So you need to make some space for these basic expenditures to provide the public good, which is stability in many countries. So technology, climate, structural, long-term, it's going to stay with us. We don't understand the impact yet, and we ought to be modest. And as scientists, we need to look into that very carefully and in a multidisciplinary way. I think this is really two topics where there's an economist, as we're not very well known for our modesty. We need to see also what's going on in other disciplines. Politics, many countries are also facing difficult internal fronts, the polarization. And what's happening in the advanced economies is not neutral for us. You take a topic like migration, it's really at the center of our relation with the European Union today. And this is also here to stay. The sort of rise of tough political party politics in advanced economies is affecting us and will affect the context of where our economic policies are taking place. You mentioned, Ibrahim, fragmentation and protectionism and the search for autonomy in security in various production factors such as energy or specific, sensitive goods. The lessons of the COVID with basic sort of medical stuff. This is affecting industrial policy in many countries. You take the European Union program and the IRA in the US. These are huge subsidies programs of subsidized industrial policies. They are affecting the allocation of foreign direct investment. We are seeing this in Morocco in a positive, with a positive impact in the electric vehicle batteries, as we have signed free trade agreements with both the European Union and the US. So, but for some others, it can be negative, and we need to see also product by product what's happening. We've never seen such a program, and also a coordinated sort of timing and responses between the two broadest, the largest economic areas in the world, and of course I add into this China that is also sort of subsidizing through extra capacities and finance its own industrial sector. So for us, most of us are middle-income countries. Industrial policy and manufacturing remains, and that's a long discussion we can have, how to escape the middle-income trap and what's the role of manufacturing into that. And I think it remains important, but it's certainly a topic that is will affect our policies. Of course, growth, and I'll close on that, and I look forward to have discussions with you and listening to the paper presentation. Growth also, take a country like Morocco, we've done everything right according to the Washington Consensus with macro policy, and our friend from the Central Bank of Morocco will also, Ibrahim, talk about this. I mean, inflation is more or less all right. We've been doing, open to trade, sign free trade agreements, fix your business climate, etc. And we're still growing at, let's say, long-term average of 2.5% per GDP per capita growth, and still not sort of converging rapidly toward higher income. So the case for most countries in the region and for also Latin America, by the way. So I think that's another conundrum in terms of, for us, and a deep, really existential question for development economists. Let me close on the method a little bit on what we try to do here in terms of platform. This university is almost brand new. We started there's another campus near Marrakesh and the third campus in Laayoune. This one is almost 3 years old. This is where we have economics, social sciences, behavioral sciences, political science, global affairs, but also a business school and as well as a center for artificial intelligence and a few other smaller groups. This university is close to 5,000 students already in our cluster, which is economics, and the others we are 600 and growing gradually. 90% of our students find a job here in this cluster before 4 months. So we must be doing something right. I always say to my colleagues, there are two fundamental criteria to measure success in this kind of environments. First, three, I would say. First, quality of the students, and are they demanded on the market? And 50% of our students go work abroad, very international. That's another discussion we can have on brain drain. But they find on average a job before 4 months. So the second is, of course, research, and the third, I would say, is the impact of research. Are we impacting our societies? Are we impacting the region of Rabat, for instance, where we are? Are we impacting public policy making? Are we impacting it through partnerships with you, of impacting other countries, growth prospects and policies? So I think that's fundamental, and we need to make an effort to measure that. So it's a space for dialogue. It's a space also to build specific culture, like-minded, and citizens that are reflexive, that can see each other and themselves. Particularly, we often the behavioral component of what we do is very strong here. We have a dedicated sort of specialty which is called behavioral social sciences for public policy. So how can we listen more? And it applies to us as well. And we see in partnerships really an opportunity to sort of rethink what we do and open new windows, and sort of be in the world, and also and irrigate beyond us. So it's not only what we do here at UM6P. We are very also mindful, and we try to, as much as we can, to embark other universities in Morocco. Very inclusive place. 50% of the students have a scholarship here. And the average rate is close to 50% as well. So it's a very inclusive university. It's a social fabric. And particularly this campus, you have students coming from all social backgrounds of Morocco. And they learn as much as they do in class through their daily life on campus. So we have many students from Rabat that choose to live on campus. And the experience is very interesting. We're able to attract many students that before used to go abroad that are now studying here. And then they go usually after the bachelor. They have wider opportunities than after the high school, by the way. So these are things also we measure. So I'm saying this because this is part, Ibrahim, this is part of how to contribute to transform. We're all in the business of trying to inform, science-based policies and, analytical work, how it can inform decision-making. We're quite frustrated in many countries how decision is made. How do you use science and methods of sciences to the fabric of public policies? So we're having extensive discussions here, and I think ERF particularly, and the policy center is, would look like you, in fact, here. But university in general are fundamental to this, and we try to acculture our students as well to that. excellence in science, but also awareness of the role of universities in societies. I think for too long, in our countries particularly, universities have been almost islands, offshore institutions that are not connected to the public policy. And there's an issue of trust as well. For many reasons, every country has its own history. We have ours, but I think this is what we try also to address here with this project. So let me close again by thanking thanking also my friend Abdurrahim and former colleague Bouazza from the Central Bank. Thank you for being with us, and he will give us a keynote. And also most welcome to all of you, and looking forward to exchange during these 3 days. This is not very common to work on Sundays in Morocco. And that's for sure. I have not waken up as early to go to work on a Sunday for years now. So thank you, Ibrahim, for making my day on this Sunday. So thank you very much.
Good morning, all of you. It's a privilege and pleasure to attend this forum. And let me begin by thanking Karim and Ibrahim for their kind invitation to join this great audience and to speak at this conference, which aims to address many important issues in the MENA region. Currently, the region is facing, in addition to challenges of the global economy, its situation is more complex. As you know, the war in Gaza has caused a tragic human toll, and massive destruction and geopolitical tensions are increasing in the broader region. In this context, the outcomes of this conference will be guided by one cornerstone: how to build stability and development to reduce human suffering and enhance well-being and prosperity in the region. Achieving this objective requires, in addition to geopolitical stability, sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Indeed, the experience of many countries show that even if the growth could be high, this will not always bring better standards of living. In fact, it could lead to an accentuation of socio-economic inequalities and territorial disparities. So my address today join this cornerstone and will focus on the main pillars of a sustainable and inclusive economic growth in the region. I will refer in my talk to some studies of international institutions and the Moroccan experience. I will also try to cover the contribution of central banks to achieve this goal. Let me start by giving a global and very short economic overview of the MENA region. While its countries share many socio-cultural characteristics, we see growing disparities between them, mainly in terms of political stability, economic structure, and GDP per capita. Beyond this divergence, the region is still globally facing many long-standing challenges. According to the IMF Inclusive Growth Index, the region ranks 5th among 7 global regions and lags significantly behind in the following areas: quality of governance and human capital, inclusion of the private sector, economic participation of women, and the fight against climate change. The region faces a dilemma: tackling these challenges at a time when, according to the IMF, the medium-term growth forecasts will remain below pre-pandemic historical levels. Allow me now to elaborate about the main reforms that should be made now more than ever, as they constitute the pillars of an inclusive and sustainable growth in the region. The first pillar is to improve the credibility and quality of institutions. Although progress has been made in the region, economic studies and surveys show that individuals and businesses continue to perceive weak governance and corruption as major problems. On this matter, I think that central bank governance could be one of the most inspiring examples. Indeed, central banks in many regions around the world have built up in the previous decades credibility to achieve their legal mandates of price stability. Thanks to their independence, they have resisted to political pressures, particularly in the last 2 years, when they were tightening their monetary policy to achieve price stability and to fight high inflation. Referring to the experience of Moroccan Central Bank, which is independent in accomplishing its mandate, I can say that in addition to ensuring financial stability, achieving this price stability is the most important contribution of central banks to sustainable and inclusive growth. That being said, these challenging times call for greater transparency and communication from central banks to maintain trust. They also need to act with well-developed capacities to better understand the functioning of the economy and the determinants of inflation. The second pillar is to accelerate economic transformation. This transformation is facing many persistent challenges in the region, of which I can mention the following: reliance on commodities, weak productivity, low women participation to the labor market, high employment, and underperformance of public sector and public companies. Tackling these challenges requires reconsidering the role of the public sector, creating a sustainable environment of private businesses, mainly SMEs, diversifying economic activities, and increasing regional integration. Turning back to our experience in Morocco, thanks to structural reforms and diversified economic strategy launched in 2 last decades, the country has been able to improve fundamentals of the economy, even if it hasn't achieved a momentum of job creation. While the public sector played the most important role in this progress, the Moroccan government aims to increase the share of private investment from 1/3 to 2/3 of the total investment by 2035 to boost productivity and to reduce unemployment. When it comes to financing the economy in the region, there is a lack of financial inclusion of SMEs, as financing essentially benefits to the public sector and large companies. However, in Morocco, the share of credit to SMEs exceeded 40% of the amount of banking loans to private companies, one of the most important in the region. The third pillar consists of improving the social protection. While many countries in the region are investing in social protection policies, they should allow to target public subsidies to the people most in need in order to preserve an equilibrium between economic efficiency and social order. It's the case in Morocco, where the government has recently launched a program to guarantee a minimum of social protection benefits to millions of vulnerable households. The following pillars concern energy and digital transitions. These pillars could be the most transformative for our societies and economies. However, the ongoing policies in this area seems to diverge in many regions of the world. The world is moving to a new digital economy, which is accelerated by AI. At the same time, the fight against climate change is progressing slowly, even if causes are well known and the impacts are becoming more critical. Certainly, this means that we haven't yet realized that climate change is a threat to our well-being. Turning back to MENA region, the picture isn't much different. The region is highly exposed to physical climate risks, as 12 countries in the region are among the 70 most water-stressed economies in the world. According to the World Bank, it's also exposed to greenhouse gas emission risk, which has increased around 21% during the last decade. This is almost equal to the largest contributors to global warming. According to many studies, inaction against climate change could result in higher losses of GDP. However, as showed by some research presented at the COP28, the energy transition could foster growth in the region. Yet this needs considerable financing, which requires from many governments to constitute budget margins. So many countries in the region have taken the path to tackle these risks by investing in renewable energy and climate-resilient infrastructure, while the phase-out of subsidies is ongoing. Tax reforms have not yet been implemented at this stage. Morocco, which imports around 90% of energy, aims to enhance the share of green energy resources to 52% in the global energy mix by 2030 and to reach low carbon emissions by 2050. It's also boosting investment in infrastructure to address water stress impacts. As climate change could affect monetary and financial stability, work is also ongoing in central banks to examine what could be the role of the monetary policy and to establish regulatory framework for managing financial risk linked to climate risk. This work is also focusing on developing taxonomies to address data limitation on climate risks, which is an important issue in addition to modeling difficulties due to the complexity of the links between macroeconomic, financial, and climate impacts. In this regard, I want to mention that Bank al-Maghrib, in collaboration with the World Bank, recently elaborated a report on the first exercise of its kind in the MENA region, which evaluates climate risks in the Moroccan banking system. It allows us to better understand the physical and transition risks and to estimate their primary impacts, which could be improved due to the challenges I mentioned before. This report is available on the website of both institutions. Let me now elaborate more about digital transition. According to a recent World Bank study, the large adoption of digital technologies in the MENA region could lead to a rise in GDP per capita of at least 46% over 30 years. However, new technologies could also threaten some jobs. According to a recent IMF study, AI could affect up to 30% of jobs across the world and 60% in advanced economies. So, many countries in the MENA region made significant progress in adopting new technologies. The others still need to do more to create an enabling environment of digital transformation. The acceleration of digital transition, if risks are well managed, could be a key contributor of reducing corruption, boosting productivity, improving payments and financial and economic inclusion, and green transition. I finish my speech with the last pillar, which is the foundation for any social and economic policies, education and skills. The OECD program for international student assessment shows that performance in the region is below international averages. Also, there is an important gap between the skills provided by the education system and the labor market needs. In several countries in the region, despite higher entrance rates at all education levels, the quality and equality of education still remains a challenge. Concerning Morocco, the ongoing reforms aim to tackle educational losses, namely secondary school dropout, and to enhance the quality of education. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for these very enlightening comments from both Dr. Karim and Mr. Abdulrahim. And thank you for the audience. I think we're going to move right away to the next session, and Shireen will take over.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you to our distinguished panelists and our host for fantastic opening remarks. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists and request that our next plenary session starts. So Dr. Samir Maqdisi, Dr. James Robinson, Dr. Wissam, Dr. Carl. Dr. Tariq Youssef. Yes? Okay. Oh, Bobby, okay, there you are.
All right.
Okay. Are we missing this? I'm missing. Nice to meet you. Are you done? Carl, yeah, that's fine. If you want to sit at the forefront, it's up to you. Okay. I start هنا. I'll switch this. لا حبيبتي أهي. Dr. Samir decided to be at the center. Right. Okay. There's your mic. Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. I wish to thank the conference organizing committee for asking me to chair this first session of ERF's 30th annual meeting. ERF has come a long way since it was founded in 1993 and held its first annual meeting in Cairo the following year in 1994. On the occasion of this 30th meeting, permit me to salute in your name its highly dedicated family, managing directors, personnel, fellows, senior and other associates, as well as, of course, as the successive boards of trustees, who over the years since its founding have together made possible a very successful ERF journey that has greatly enriched the region's economic and social research work and contributed to a more enlightened understanding of the role of economic policy in guiding the region's development. In the years to come, I feel confident that ERF will continue on its successful journey with ever-increasing vigor. Now, to this session, in this opening plenary on Panoramic Political Economy Perspective of MENA, the keynote speaker is, as we know, Professor James Robinson, who will address the question of why the Arab Spring and its what-for reforms failed. A very important question indeed. In introducing him, I shall be very brief, as he is well known as a highly distinguished academician who has conducted influential research in the field of political and economic development and the relationship between political power, institutions, and prosperity. His well-known and influential book, Why Nations Fail, which he co-authored with Professor Darren Acemoglu, has been translated into 37 languages. Professor Robinson is Reverend Richard Pearson Professor of Global Studies, Conflict Studies, and University Professor at the University of Chicago. And as would be expected, he is the recipient of numerous distinguished medals. Professor Robinson's presentation will be followed by comments by 4 distinguished discussants. Very briefly, Dr. Nahal Makkawi, Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Wissam al-Bey, Regional Director, Middle East and North Africa at International Development Research Center. Dr. Carl Bernadac, if I'm pronounced it correctly, Deputy Director for Innovation, Strategy and Research, Agence Française de Développement, and Dr. Tariq Youssef, Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. No doubt, their commentaries will set the stage for an exciting discussion to follow. But before I give the floor to Professor Robinson, I would like to underscore the continued absence of equitable resolutions of major conflicts facing the region, in particular the question of Palestine, of which the ongoing Gaza tragedy is its most recent manifestation. I believe that the absence of equitable solutions is a major contributor to what Professor Robinson calls developmentalism with autocracy. Whether the resolution of these major regional conflicts might lead to developmentalism with whatever forms of democracy each country finds suitable is a matter of consideration and debate that I leave to our distinguished speakers and panel. Professor Robinson will take up, as agreed, 20 minutes and for his presentation, and each of the commentators less than 10 minutes, hopefully between 7 to 8 minutes, because this would allow for 35 minutes for the general discussion to follow, which I'm sure is going to be full of questions and debate. Professor Robinson.
No. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, the ERF and Dr. El Badawi. I'm very excited to be here. I was just trying to figure out the length of my interaction with the ERF. I think I was here in Cairo in person for the first time in 2006, but actually one of my papers, which was co-authored with Jeffrey Nugent, was presented at the ERF and published in the ERF conference volume probably in 1997 or something like that. So I'm getting close to 30 years of interaction with the ERF. And nowadays it's so easy to appear on Zoom and things like that. It's great to be here and see old friends and, you know, remind yourself of why we have events like this, because it's so important, the human interaction and discussion and debate. And so I've been really having a lot of fun. So thank you for inviting me and persuading me to come. So I'm going to have the temerity to talk about this topic of why did the Arab Spring fail. I'm very interested in institutions and the dynamics of institutions. And that for me and Professor Ajimolu, you know, the Arab Spring was something extremely salient when we were writing this book, Why Nations Fail. So salient that it forms the entire preface of the book. And let me just try to remind you a little bit, you know, without insulting, you know, your extensive knowledge of why nations fail, what we said in the preface, you know, because we thought about the Arab Spring through the lens of our theory of how inclusive institutions drive economic development. And the key problem of development is really an institutional problem of moving from extractive institutions to inclusive institutions. And of course, that's about economics and economic opportunity and social mobility. But for us, it's much more of a political problem than it is a technocratic economic problem. It's about creating inclusive political institutions that form the basis for an inclusive economy. And so when we looked at the Arab Spring, we saw people in societies with clearly extractive political institutions living under military, other types of autocracies, trying to create more inclusive societies through collective action, through protest, through demonstration. And that was exactly what our theory was about. And as the book was published, of course, we didn't know how things were going to go. President Ben Ali had stepped down, President Mubarak had stepped down. There was enormous uncertainty in other parts of the world, like in Libya. So what did we predict at the time? Well, we sort of said, we said, what drives this transition from more extractive to inclusive institutions is collective action. And we had a lead example, you know, which you might think was ludicrous in this context, but at least gives me some way of talking about mechanisms and expectations, which was the English Glorious Revolution of 1688. So this was the moment where sort of constitutional monarchy was created and absolutism was defeated in Britain through a revolution, you know, which we made analogies to the Arab Spring, okay? So, but it's obvious if you look at history that revolutions don't necessarily lead to better institutions. They don't necessarily lead to inclusive institutions. You know, my favorite example would be, you're all too young to know who the English rock group The Who was, you know, but if you know The Who, you could check it out on YouTube, listen to their song, Won't Get Fooled Again. Their song, Won't Get Fooled Again, is all about what we call the iron law of oligarchy. You know, here's the last line in the song, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, you know. So there's protests, there's contestation against extractive institutions, but what ends up happening is a new boss who looks just like the old boss, a kind of recreation of extractive institutions, often with a new face at the top. And this goes back, you know, to this old work of Pareto and Mosca in sociology, you know, 120 years ago, where they developed this anti-Marxist agenda to say, you know, there's no pattern in history, you know, like Marx said, there's feudalism, there's capitalism, there's socialism, there's no direction of progress. What Mosca and Pareto said is no, elites come and revolve, but the system keeps going, okay? So then why wouldn't the iron law of oligarchy apply? And the main concept in the book, which I'm going to sort of put pressure on today, is what we called a broad coalition, you know. So we said, the iron law of oligarchy didn't apply in the case of the Glorious Revolution because there was a broad coalition contesting power with the autocratic regime, okay? So what happened next? I think what happened next, this is data from the VDEM project, which looks at, measures various types of democracy, electoral democracy, liberal democracy, participatory democracy. Here's the Arab Spring in Egypt, bump up, bump down. Okay, so this is the iron law of oligarchy. You can see the same thing, even more dramatic in Tunisia. Things move a lot further in Tunisia, but then they move a lot further on the way back again. So this is exactly the iron law of oligarchy, and I think that's what we've seen. Despite our predictions of maybe something different happening. Okay, so what is this broad coalition that makes a difference between a transition to inclusive institutions or the iron law of oligarchy? I have to say, in retrospect, that was a little under-conceptualized in the book. But thinking about this talk today has made me think a lot more about it. I think when we were writing about this, we had something like, what in American political science is called pluralism, that vibrant civil society, kind of civil society organizations which are autonomous from the state, or maybe what my former colleague Robert Putnam would have called a lot of social capital, a lot of associational life, organizations, etc. And in fact, at the time of the Arab Spring and afterwards, that theory seemed to sort of work, because the big success story was Tunisia, where there clearly were civil society organizations, trade unions, the National Dialogue Quartet, which were autonomous from the state, that could organize to try to push for institutional change. Okay, I think there's two aspects of this, though, this connection between the nature of civil society and transitions to inclusive institutions. You could say one is just the kind of ability to act collectively and organize to oppose an extractive regime. But the other thing, which turns out to be perhaps more key in this context, is, after the extractive regime has been toppled, after Ben Ali and President Mubarak disappeared, how to reach some sort of consensus or agreement on how to organize effective, inclusive institutions. And it seems that that was the part that failed in Egypt and Tunisia, although maybe for different reasons. Okay, so I think, talking about this idea of civil society and the kind of, the depth of civil society, or how civil society is organized and how is it autonomous from the state, I think, as from a theoretical perspective, it's not obvious, it's not obvious that having a more diverse civil society makes it easier to agree on things. But we did, in my defense, we did at least have a mechanism. We proposed a mechanism from the Glorious Revolution. And I remind you of this just to kind of emphasize how this mechanism may not apply in the case that I'm talking about, which is, we had this idea that the more diverse the interests you have in society, the more difficult it is to recreate a kind of autocratic regime, because it's very hard for anyone to see them on top. I'll give you a very concrete example. So in the Glorious Revolution in England, one of the problems was the King, James II, was intervening in the legal system. So a judge made a ruling he didn't like, he would get rid of the judge and try to put a friendly judge in. And this was a big source of contention, and it was something that brought many different groups and people together. But you can imagine getting a meeting together, and I'm here, we're in a room, I'm trying to say, James II, he's an autocrat, he's trying to create an absolutist state, we need to get rid of him, let's act, let's, we'll get some guns, and we'll, whatever. So, and then, and I could say, if we get rid of him, we'll get the legal decisions that we like. Now he's getting the legal decisions that he likes, but if we're in power, we'll get the legal decisions we like. But the thing is, the more diverse the people, the more difficult it is to, if I'm in a dispute with you, we can't both get the legal decisions we like. It's either you or me. And so the mechanism we had in mind was, somehow with all these diverse interests at play, it's very difficult for anyone to imagine themselves kind of being on top and kind of designing an institution in their favor. So then it emerges, and this is really an argument that comes from the great British social historian E.P. Thompson in his book Whigs and Hunters, that what happens is I can't be on top and you can't expect to be on top. So let's have a kind of level playing field. Let's level the playing field, and no one gets an advantage. And this was our kind of mechanism for how this more pluralistic society, you might say, led to something like the emergence of an agreement to have more inclusive political institutions. I think the problem with that, for me, thinking through this talk today, is, what sort of society was that conditional on in some sense? British society probably is very distinct sociologically from society in MENA today, or the society that started the Arab Spring. And it's very under-conceptualized in our work, I think, like how was that society different? And in what way were those differences important? Was it specific types of cleavages? Were there particular sorts of disagreements that were somehow easier to resolve in the British case or more complicated to resolve in the case of the Arab Spring? I don't know the answer. This is just my train of thought. And I must say, if you read the Why Nations Fell today, and if you thought about, I wrote that book a long time ago. I changed my mind about lots of things, and I find myself endlessly, having to defend it, against the current me. But if I was going to tell you, say, one thing that we never talk about in Why Nations Fail, that is sort of embarrassing in retrospect, that we spend a lot of time thinking about nowadays, for example, is religion. If you think about the English Civil War in the 1640s and what changed between the English Civil War and 1688, one thing is religion more or less disappeared from politics. At the time of the Civil War, here's Charles I, who was the monarch, James II's father, who was the monarch. He really thought, God had made him monarch. Like, he genuinely thought that. He genuinely thought that this was a huge problem. Here's a picture of him. He thought he could heal people by touching them, and he did it 92,000 times. There's a book by a historian about this that claims he did it 92,000. He was very busy touching people, and he justified it by quoting the Bible. And it wasn't just Charles I. Charles I's opponent was Oliver Cromwell, his main opponent, Oliver Cromwell, who then became head of state after the Civil War. The most famous biography of Oliver Cromwell is called God's Englishman. Okay, Oliver Cromwell really thought he too was undertaking God's will of restructuring British society. You can see here, this is a satirical etching from the time, quoting "Kings here kill and take possession." It's sort of satirical because here's Cromwell's men cutting down the royal oak, the sacred royal oak of England. It's a sort of satirical, but it's kind of satirizing his piety and the fact that he thought this is God and the prophet Elijah in Kings. Anyway, so here's a dramatic change, kind of sociological change between the Civil War and 1688, which is this. James II didn't touch anybody, and he didn't think he could heal people. So that's just an example of a sort of dramatic sociological change that, we didn't think about in the book, but maybe it's relevant for thinking about the context in the Middle East. Okay, so and I think, coming back to what is this issue of pluralism and the nature of civil society and how that may interact with these dynamics from extractive to inclusive institutions, I think an obvious hypothesis about why the iron law of oligarchy kind of operated in the Egyptian case, it's not really about the nature of civil society. You could say civil society was incredibly organized. The Muslim Brotherhood were incredibly organized, but they weren't ideologically committed to democracy. They were ideologically committed to a very different type of state and a very different type of state organization. And for me, as an outsider, that seems to have a lot to do with the collapse of the nascent democratic regime and the kind of the legitimization of the reinvention of the reintervention of the military. I think in Tunisia, it's a completely different mechanism. It's much more to do with the difficulty for post-Ben Ali governments of agreeing on how to create effective, inclusive institutions. I think the data from the Arab Barometer is very devastating on this over time. You look at the rise of the perception of corruption in Tunisia, it starts pretty high when Ben Ali was there, and it only gets higher, so it gets up to almost 100% of people thinking, that there's corruption in state institutions and national agencies, large or medium extent. And you see, along with that, I could show you other things, just a complete sort of disillusionment with democracy, poor economic performance and indecision. So under a democratic system, the country's economic performance is weak. That starts down at, 19%. I don't know what the percentage of the population were members of Ben Ali's, what was it, the Neo Destur party. Maybe that was the party members thought that democracy had poor performance and indecision, but, by the end it gets up to 75%. And that's pretty true for all of these things. So there's an enormous disillusionment with democracy to solve kind of basic problems that people are concerned about. And I guess from this perspective, it's not so surprising in what's happened in Tunisia over the last 18 months. Okay, so let me focus on this. In some sense, both of those examples are, it's difficult. They're very different, it seems to me, but they're both examples, you could say, of difficulty of forming an effective social contract after kind of expelling this extractive regime. Okay? I think Timur Kuran, has a very influential recent book. I think it's a very interesting book, a recent book about trying to explain, it's called Freedoms Delayed, trying to explain why freedoms have been delayed in the MENA region, and arguing that this is exactly to do with the failure of a kind of Western-style civil society, which he blames on Islamic law and the Waqf and other specific kind of institutions. But I would say, what strikes me as a kind of political economist is the very different political culture in the Islamic world. In Western political thought, going all the way back to Aristotle, there's this idea that there are specific challenges. Any type of government you create is going to have specific challenges. You could create a monarchy, but the problem with monarchy is monarchy deteriorates into despotism. So Aristotle outlined these different systems of governments and their kind of perversion, and he says, how you solve this problem is through what he called mixed government. It's a sort of nascent checks and balances or separation of powers, and that idea runs through Western political theory for thousands of years, through Polybius and Cicero, Machiavelli, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at Islamic political thought, there's no similar discussion whatsoever. There's hardly any discussion of institutionalized constraints on the use of power. And I think that's very much to do with different notions of the law and different notions of kind of what the problem was and how you solved the problem. But surely these different types of philosophical ideas are important in trying to think about, why was it so difficult to create a liberal democratic regime? So I don't think it's just about civil society or this organizational capacity. It's also about different normative positions, and which made it very difficult to try to create kind of working liberal democratic institutions. And I think, these seem to be, these types of ideas that I was, alluding to, seem to be very persistent in the Middle East. And, of course, it's true that civil society is weak. This is data from VDEM they have an index of the strength of civil society. The light blue at the bottom is the MENA region. So civil society is, weak. But I guess that's not, weak in what way, I guess, is I'm trying to emphasize. So I'm trying to say, I'm worried I'm talking too much. How long do I have left? Okay, great. So I'm trying to think through, why this iron law of oligarchy applied, why the broad coalition didn't emerge. What does this broad coalition mean exactly? Is it about collective action, or is it about ability to kind of agree on new institutions or effective institutions, and trying to think about what underlying kind of social factors or cultural factors or ideational factors may make that more or less easy. And I guess trying to think myself through how the MENA region is maybe different from these cases that Daron and I focused on in the book. And I think trying to think about that, it must be also important at the same time that, if you look at the MENA region, what you see now, what I see is the rise of these very successful illiberal states, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia trying to do the same thing. So while you have Tunisia, malfunctioning, or Lebanon, GDP per capita falling by 50% and kind of total inaction in Lebanon, the banking system shuts down, nothing happens. You have these other illiberal stories, which look like a success. And I have to say, as a social scientist, you could say, this is not just about the Gulf. What about China? What about Singapore? What about South Korea? What about Taiwan? That social scientists haven't managed to tackle well the rise of these illiberal development successes. So it's not just the last 10 or 20 years, it's the last 50 years. So that's a challenge for all of us, and I would say, I missed this slide here. No, I won't go back to it because never go back in life. Yeah. So I went back to the preface, but, thinking about this, I'm not an expert in the MENA region. Most of my work, for the last 20 years has been in sub-Saharan Africa. And I thought, if I thought about the problems in creating liberal democratic states in sub-Saharan Africa post-independence, I'd think about underlying cultural and structural factors. I'd think about the fact that, liberalism is very fixated on individual rights, kind of in the absence of obligations, But most African society is much more collectivist and focused much more on the community and people's relationship to the community and people's notion of personhood, which is intimately connected to the community in a way that's not true in Western, highly individualistic society. I think about the fact that, Africans like to make decisions by consensus. The legitimate way to make a decision in Africa is not through majority rule, but it's via consensus and attempting to reach a consensus. And the fact that, African political society historically was extremely decentralized and very badly matched to modern nation states, these huge nation states with hundreds of disparate social contracts all matched up together. And in fact, thinking about, looking at success stories in Botswana, like success stories in Africa, like Botswana and Somaliland, actually, they don't look like Western democracies. Botswana doesn't look like it's very well governed, but it doesn't look like a democracy, a Western democracy. Sure, there are elections. The same party's been in power for 40 years. It always wins. Okay, that's actually not where the politics is. The politics is not in the presidential palace. It's not in elections. Governance is not achieved by threatening to kick somebody out of power, because the Botswana Democratic Party never loses power. Politics is at the local level. Politics is through the traditional institutions like the Hotla, which were kind of modernized in the 1960s and built into the modern state. And it's a pretty illiberal type of system. Also, it functions, and it fits with the culture in many ways. And I would say the same thing. I've been doing some research in Somaliland, last year, and going forward, I hope. Somaliland, the success of Somaliland is somehow similar to that. Like, it's built in the cultural context. It's not terribly liberal. It built the clans into the modern state, but it works in the context of their own cultural system. So I'm going to come back to that thought. All right. And when I think about this, thinking about Somaliland or Botswana, or thinking about how political culture in the MENA world is sort of distinct from Western political culture in many ways, I think, we're still, and I think Timur's book kind of suffers from this, it's sort of freedom's delayed. Like, his idea is, civil society will get organized in the Middle East, Islamic law will kind of deteriorate, and then we'll have, something like the Glorious Revolution or whatever. I have to say my current way of thinking about this is that it's probably completely delusional. The world is very different, cultures are very different, and, we've all been living in this, end of history sort of moment, where like the Francis Fukuyama kind of idea that we're all converging, to Western liberal democracy. So Frank, always says that I never made the claim, that the positive claim that everywhere is converging to liberal democracy. But I did make the normative claim that there's only one justifiable political system. That's complete nonsense. I think that's even more wrong than the positive claim, actually. There are many different justifiable, legitimate political systems, and it's ridiculous to say that liberal democracy is the only one. I don't think they have liberal democracy in Botswana, but I do think it is a legitimate political system. We're in Morocco. There's a king. But is that? I'm British. We have a king, by the way. Incidentally. Is that not a legitimate? Yes, it is legitimate. It's incredibly popular. It's much more popular than the elected politicians, okay? And I've worked in many parts of Africa with traditional political institutions that don't look anything like liberal democracy, but are extremely popular, okay? So let me shut up. This is my last slide, I promise, okay? And where am I going with this? I think that, any type of political institutions has to have some instrumental justification. We like it because it generates good public policy, it reduces poverty, it provides economic growth, it provides, freedoms or whatever, of whatever kind we value, okay? But it's not a magic wand. Think about the Tunisian case. We know on average it's true that liberal democracy generates better provision of public goods and more rapid economic growth. But we also know there's terrific heterogeneity. And that's what's going on, that's what went on in Tunisia. They created liberal democracy, but it went on with clientelism, with corruption, with the type of phenomena and the type of mechanisms that are not conducive to good public policy, not conducive to, so it's not a magic wand, okay? So that means that any kind of normative justification for liberal democracy becomes incredibly important. And when I look at the world today, I think the problem in the last 30 years is we've been so obsessed with this kind of end of history that nobody bothers to justify from a kind of philosophical or moral point of view why we like liberal democracy. Why do we like it and why do we value it? And is it the right type of political system in the kind of cultural context that we're living in? We just have this kind of package, that we sort of implement or we push wherever we are in the world, and I think those examples of Botswana and Somaliland are kind of fascinating because they're both cases where the Swana people or the Somalis kind of got the breathing space to sort of say, okay, fine, we're going to do it like this, we're going to design it like this is how it's going to work, and it did work, okay? So I'm sort of saying, this is, sure, it's about designing institutions to make democratic governance more effective and stuff, but it's also about ideas, and it's about trying to justify why we want this and what we value, what we care about here. It's very much about these normative justifications, of which there's precious little, it seems to me. There's just this idea that, people in Tunisia thought that democracy was going to be a magic wand. Of course, they were suffering from many aspects of the dictatorship, but just what was going to follow from that and just how it was going to improve their lives, I think, was under-conceptualized. Okay, sorry, I talked too much. I may have turned it off.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, thank you. Thank you, ERF, for this invitation. Thank you for being on such a wonderful first plenary with distinguished colleagues and a very distinguished panel leader and moderator, Dr. Samir. Thank you for allowing me to say a couple of words after James Robinson's interesting, provocative, and to a great extent, candid and honest presentation. We need nothing else in today's mad world than candor and honesty. Also about where academia and social science have succumbed to some hegemonic ideas for too long. So thank you for opening up this conversation. In fact, I'll try very quickly in very telegraphic messages to tell you a lot more about James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu's seminal work than you heard of today. I'll agree with a lot, and I'll beg to disagree with some. But I'll be telegraphic because I don't have that much time. So before massacring my reputation and my ideas, have mercy on me thinking I was just telegraphic, okay? So allow me quickly to run through some of the very useful nuance that both James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu have given us through their seminal works. And I'll tell you where I see they've had a good chunk of knowledge that provide explanations for the Middle East and North Africa, but also where I may slightly push for some extra work on our part, all of us in the community of social sciences. It has been assumed that societies transition to democracy when certain conditions are fulfilled, and those conditions have been assumed to be economic development, education, because it's needed in industrialized labor forces, a sizable middle class, because it creates moderation in the demands of society, a legal system, because it creates certainty, particularly for owners of property and for investors, and a tradition of a belief in the intrinsic value of democracy. This is the terrain where James and Darren and other colleagues have been working for years with those assumptions, axioms about development. The nuance they introduced was as follows. Inherent conflict among social classes drives history. And the social classes in their case were classes to be defined by political and economic power. And there was a lot of contingency in what they said. Nothing was inevitable. There were lots of moments where things could go in either direction in that conflict between those who owned political and economic power and those who didn't. Second, the second nuance they produced, very important for our region and many others in the world, inequality. Inequality drives social unrest. And that's the moment when the elites think it's getting to be too much now. The risk of rebellion is credible. So we need to do something to stave off revolutions. And here is a moment in their work which is fascinating, because here is where either the elite decides to oppress or to democratize. And they talk about the cost of oppression and the cost of democratization. Here is a moment where society, on the other hand, says we are demanding democracy. But how do we demand it in such a way that doesn't scare away the elite too much? These are the subtle conversations that happen in democratization processes through all sorts of indicators and signals. If we get too much into the details of the headlines of newspapers, we lose a lot of those nuances. I beg you in the future, when you look at the newspaper every morning, not to get caught into those details. These are the weeds. And reach to a bigger and higher story. The third nuance that comes out in the work is something very important to MENA, which is to handle inequality, both society and elites need to decide on the policies of redistribution. They don't talk much about what is now important to us in the Middle East under this theme of redistribution, which is how do you design policies of social transfer and social protection, and who will pay for them? This is key here in this region. Because of the high rates of inequality in this region, we have to worry about policies of social protection and social transfer, and much more so, how are we going to pay for them? Because at the end of the day, we ended up paying for them by debt, by taking loans that the future generations will not be able to pay for. So the fourth nuance that comes out in their incredibly seminal work is the importance of inclusive institutions, and that you heard James talk about. Not extractive, but inclusive. And I think to a great extent, this is important also in the MENA region. And it takes us back to the question of How are we going to design public policy? Who is going to design it? Who is paying? And how are the transfers going down to those who really need it? And here you find in the MENA region a lot of work that has been done already on social transfer policies and social protection policies, whether it is in Egypt or in Morocco or in Tunisia. And these are important conversations to continue to have. Of course, the second sub-theme on inclusive institutions is the design of political institutions. And here again, Tunisia and Egypt diverge greatly. Tunisia tried inclusive political institutions. Egypt gave up on that early on in the revolution because of the kind of military institution that decided to protect Egypt from all the conflict that was going around it. So they just gave up too early on inclusive institutions. Tunisia tried, but failed, I would say, because the miserable failure was actually on the social protection and the social justice issue, where in Tunisia that's very important, particularly if you link it to regional disparity of income, wealth, and development. Then comes the fifth nuance in James's work, which has to do with the important role of collective action on the part of society and civil society. And here is where I say we still lack a lot of work, particularly on measuring civil society. There are no less than 7 big institutions around the world today trying to measure civil society and create indices for civil society. James used one of them, but there are very, very many more. And we need to figure out in the Middle East, as social scientists, how are we going to contribute to the work on measuring civil society, because it helps us understand also his other major theme, which is broad coalitions. Tunisia was a lot better than many, many, many other Arab countries in building a broad coalition that pushed through the revolution from day one. Yet, it stopped at a certain point in time. In the case of Egypt, the polarization was clear from day one and continues to be there. I would like to thank James and his colleagues for having, throughout your work, helped us understand that there is no inevitability in history, that people have agency, and there are always moments of choice during democratization processes. We choose, nothing inevitable. And the Middle East right now, and that's my final closing piece, the Middle East right now is facing incredible moments of choice. We can choose not to make our future generations so indebted that they are fragile and vulnerable and will take any crap in order to survive. We can choose today not to be so indebted with loans if we make better choices. We can choose today better political institutional arrangements. We can choose today to pull a lot more out of poverty and expand the middle class, if we want to. My final remark on what you said, James, is conversion. The West and the Middle East are converging. Could you believe that? 20 years ago, the West and the Middle East are converging at a dangerous point of weak trust in institutions that cuts across the USA, Europe, and the Middle East. Also weak trust in multilateral organizations, high polarization in society, and inhumane violence, the epitome of which is being committed currently by the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. Our job as ERFers requires utmost insistence on principled thought and rigor, and that's what James gave us in his opening speech today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring and very provocative ideas that are surfacing, and I really appreciate being part of this panel and part of this interesting discussion at a very critical time in the region. Of course, when we think about the MENA region, we're not thinking about a homogeneous, set of countries. It's actually a fascinating study in contrasts. You have in this region some of the wealthiest countries and some of the poorest countries as well. And what the region has in common is that it's the politics, the economics, the social aspects are very much intertwined. And of course, with a colonial legacy that impacts the decisions and the thought process inside the region, the impact of religion, the impact of tribal and clan affiliations, and the struggle of democracy and human rights form and shape the relation between the government and its citizens. So this is important to think about. In my remarks, I want to focus on 3 points from the perspective of IDRC and from linking all this to development and development research. First, to provide maybe another perspective about the Arab Spring and whether or not it has brought positive as well as negative changes. Second, I want to allude to the build in the local expertise and the concept of localization, and how at this critical time in the region's progress, that we can also think about how important is decolonizing knowledge and how we can use the local expertise in order to drive some of the important decision-making that has to do with development and growth. So of course, the Arab Spring was a historic moment that took the region and the world by surprise. But it showed the power of the people to voice their concern, demand change, and challenge the status quo. It resulted in overthrow of long-standing regimes, but also emerged a lot of conflict and inequalities. It opened the political space, but it also exposed deep divisions as well. It sparked a wave of cultural and social movements that would not have happened otherwise, and also faced backlash from conservatism and authoritarian forces. So we could think of the Arab Spring as a failure, but also societal change does take time, and we're talking about 10, 15 years, and I don't think that the story is over yet. I think it's actually unfolding beyond our own eyes. What I really refer to when I talk about, having experienced also the ups and downs of the aspirations of the people rising to change and then being faced with resistance, the resilience of the people to continue actually on demanding different changes and different social and economic rights. We've seen it during COVID-19. We've seen it during addressing the repercussions of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how this has affected the economy and social aspects in our own region. And we are seeing it now as we're witnessing what's happening in Gaza and how people are standing up and continuing to demand their freedom. I also want to say that post-Arab Spring in particular has unleashed quite advantages, particularly with young people. We have seen a rising wave of entrepreneurial spirit, a lot of startups that are demanding change and taking matters in their own hand to address economic, social, and even environmental wave that has not started before the revolution. The independent rise of art and culture, and on some of the thorny topics that were not addressed before the revolution. So this is really important aspect. And of course, with the wave of digitalization, we're finding a lot more voices that are coming on digital media to reach new audiences that are trying to get away from the censorship and the control. These are positive initiatives, and I say those are really positive local initiatives that I think organizations that are working to support development have to really capitalize on. So this is a key lesson from the Arab Spring, the value of localization. And it means also that there is an importance to respect the specific contexts, cultures, and challenges of the region, and to use local experiences and knowledge in order to address solutions that are meeting the aspirations of the people, but also are convenient and that are suited to the opportunities. I want to give an example of how we can actually use localization as a way in order to address some of the emerging challenges. I mean, other colleagues have talked about climate change, the energy transition, the challenge now with the digitalization. So one project that IDRC is supporting is in actually collaboration with the Economic Research Forum, the Middle East Institute, and the Lebanese Center for Policy Study, is trying to understand the energy transition and its implication on small, micro, and medium enterprises. Using local researchers, local expertise to see how the policies could be informed by the existing challenges and opportunities that exist. But also at the same time, energy transition, for example, requires global standards and requires that there is collaboration with international actors and institutions. So we cannot say that we want to substitute globalization with localization, but there has to be a fine balance and mix in order to make sure that solutions that are chosen are locally rooted and locally driven, but at the same time that continue the interaction and the exchange at a global level. So I take it now to the specific of what we do at IDRC, which is to support research for development. And with the emphasis on decolonizing knowledge, meaning that we have to look at the challenging a little bit the narratives and the paradigms that have shaped the region's history, development, and even democracy goals. Decolonizing knowledge and research and innovation in the Global South supports local perspectives, but at the same time benefits from the global exchange and experience. What I want to highlight about decolonizing knowledge, it means that when we are talking with organizations that have investments in local researchers, we also have to look at the enabling environment. So for example, another project that we are working on with the Arab Council for Social Sciences, it's how to safeguard academic freedom in the Arab region, so that when researchers actually generate knowledge, that they feel safe and that it can actually be used without being censored, and how to create more linkages between researchers and policymakers. I leave you with maybe a couple of questions that might actually warrant more exploration. What is the right balance between global and local? And how can we support leadership at the local level and at the same time integrate regional knowledge and needs within a global world that is more independent and that is more interlinked? How can we use the local expertise in order to come up with solutions that could inform global agendas? I want to highlight, lastly, what's happening currently in the region. We have seen that there isn't kind of a blueprint for democracy. There isn't a blueprint for the universal application of human rights. Where is the regional narrative of how to apply such global standards? Thank you very much.
Is it working? Yes. Thank you very much. I'm Carl Bernadac from the French Development Agency. I want to thank ERF for the kind invitation to share with you, and UMCSP for hosting us and stimulating the debate. And I must say I'm grateful to be part of the discussion and humbled as well, and challenged. It's not the easiest panel to be on from the perspective where I'm talking from, but I will try to give a few points. And first of all, when I was mentioning the partnership with ERF and responding to our colleague from DRC, it's quite important in this, what you mentioned of localization or decolonization of research. For us for Development Bank, European Development Bank, we have a research program, and one of our principles is to do research together, because it's very important. Where are we thinking from? So I'm grateful of the partnership we can have with ERF, UMCSP, and other research centers from the region and the countries where we are intervening. Then I want to thank Professor Robinson for your brilliant presentation. I will try to give a few points. From my perspective, who brings us as AFD, humility and stimulus. Humility because development institutions have been variable and challenge on how do we tackle democracy or the nature of regime in our cooperation, and stimulus for how can we support. And a few points. First, when we were discussing with my colleague this session, we said, okay, what do we call democracy? What is it? And you alluded to Professor Robinson, and we have to acknowledge that it is an abstract concept with no strong definition. One definition can government by discussion. Once you have said that, you open more doors than you close them. It's multidimensional. You alluded to as well. Do you understand it at a local level, at a central level? We're talking after the sanitary crisis about inclusive or democratic sanitary challenges and so forth. And it has been contested. Is it a universal outreach? And we have to acknowledge the variety, and you alluded to as well, because Robert Dahl have in 98, given some I would say guarantees for free democratic regime, electoral democracy. But scanning in 2021, it's true, as wrote in numerous papers on different type of regime. So it gives us the nuances, and even if we stay at the scale of state, to simplify the purpose, give us nuances between electoral, liberal, participative, deliberative, egalitarian, majority, and consensus. Some of them that can be complementary, and some others that can be more mutually exclusive. And so this is the part of humility and recognizing the diversity of democratic regime. Then I will indeed abound in your stance of, no, it's not the end of the history, it hasn't been. And maybe for that, emphasize three phases and how development institutions have positioned themselves in these three phases. We had the first one in the 1950s to 1990 with a slow democratization, and we were in a time of where we believed in the theory of modernization. First, economic growth, welfare, and then democracy will come. And development institutions were not, focusing on the nature of regime, and they were not quite interested in or involved in that. And then we had the global democratization between 1990 and 2010, with neo-institution, the transition theory, and the instrumental value of democratization. And then international development institutions, multilaterals, World Bank, and also bilaterals such as mine, insisted a lot on even conditionality on the nature of the regime for financial and technical cooperation, insistence of support to civil society, and the importance of participation. Sometimes with oversimplification, we must acknowledge, so this is again the part of humility. I remember a course with Pippa Norris, and she referred us to a book, the Tyranny of Participation. the way sometimes this was understood and practiced by institutions to do, I mean, for those involved in development, what we called rapid rural assessment, where indeed you only reveal the voice of the powerful, but it's not participation really. So we have to be modest on what we understood at that time. And then from now on, from 2000, 2010, a backlash. We see that in the I would say the nature of, by Vedem, the four or five nature of regime. So a backlash and an erosion. So it's kind of an hybridization with some challenges of polarization. I will come back after. And for institutional development and international cooperation, we have to acknowledge also the fact of re-geopolitization of international cooperation, the management of crisis, and a strong focus from that time on global public goods and climates, for instance. And I will come back because there was an interesting point by the director from the central banks, and you alluded to as well on democracy and environmental. I will come back to that at the end. So a bit the three phases, and indeed we are not at the end of the history. My third point would be on you alluded to the instrumental value of democracy, and indeed if we understand development as economic growth or income per capita, or even the development index, the Human Development Index by the UNDP, the UN Development Agency, and there's no correlation. I mean, I'm sorry for my lack of digital application, but you will see it clearly enough from here. This is Human Development Index, and this is Index of Democracy. So all you need to see is there is no correlation. Okay, sorry, next time I'll try to enter into the digital era, but I'm still on the paper one. So this is true, there is no instrumental value, but it depends on how do we define development. If we shift to Amartya Sen and his seminal, well, one of the seminal book, Development as Freedom, and the ability of humans to realize themselves as human beings, then indeed we could see and literature show a stronger link of democratic regime with all the nuances and different type of democratic regime I related to at the beginning, and development. In conclusion, and this will be my last point, what can we do together, and from the perspective of development cooperation as well? First, what we have seen, and this has been said also by Professor Robinson, even if there is a fatigue and in the recent period of democracy, there is still an aspiration on it, on the dimension of freedom and Amartya Sen's sense of it, I would say. So we have to try to fight back this fatigue. How? One of the channel could be the efficacy of or the efficiency of institution, and in particular to tackle inequalities in our work when we have policy dialogue on reforms. I think it's very important to show how reforms will be progressive, or if there is a part of progressive, how are you going to compensate that? Inequalities, as you underline, is quite key. And then to come back to also one of the main conclusions of Professor Robinson. Before listening to you again, we wrote to support innovation, and in a paper that we wrote in AFD. And you're right, it's not only innovation, it's also local practices. And the Lechotla, for instance, I was based in South Africa, and I could see in municipal governance, in city governance, the juxtaposition between, I would say, classic legislative assembly. So South Africa is a very legislative political regime, and at the same time, the Lechotla, the deliberative assembly. How they intertwine, or how can we support both and understand the interlinked between them? How can we support also democracy through the commons approach? No? in the modern, continuing Eleanor Ostrom's views on the commons, are not only to share access to an assets, but how do you govern this access and how do you deliberate on the rights of the inhabitants or citizens to do so. And the second two, the last two ones, is to fight against disinformation. This is more and more key for our institution, not taking a stance, but to fight against disinformation, and artificial intelligence pose an opportunity and a challenge as well. And last but not least, and again, with a lot of humility coming from France, we had, France is known for its fashion, and we had the yellow jacket, no? And you remember that yellow jacket in the street when we wanted to impose a carbon tax for ecological transition, people didn't like it, blocked the road, and so forth. So how can we improve the political debate, avoiding, as far as we can, polarization? And you mentioned polarization, and we believe polarization is a great threat of democratic, I would say, or inclusive regime, whatever the exact nature of them. And this is important, and I will stop there in one. Do I have 30 seconds more, sir? 1 minute? 1 second? 1 minute. Thank you. After this contextualization and support to innovation, we believe it's quite important to these factors to help the regime to reinvent the social contract. And when from economic research, where I come from, development economics, we insist on ecological transition, and the director of the central bank also insisted on the role of central banks to tackle physical and transition risk of climate change, regulating the financial sectors. But we will need to build a new social contract. And this will be a great challenge. In MENA, climate change is putting the society at risk with the water scarcity, and this could be a risk for the social contracts. Or do you reinvent that? How do you politicize decision for the ecological transition? And this is an important point for us as cooperation. And in the end, whatever the regime, and I will conclude by that, for us, social contract is pretty linked also to a concept by Achille Mbembe talking about democracy. We have electoral procedures, and sometimes, at least from the Western perspective, we insisted too much on electoral procedures. And this is an eye-opener also, your presentation, Professor Robinson. And we have maybe to find solution how to support actions for substantive democracy. This is to convert inhabitants in citizens in one way or another of inclusive regime to take part in the deliberation and policy decisions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just gonna set my alarm watch. Bismillah, assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to ERF for organizing this very important 30-year anniversary of the annual meeting, and for inviting me to participate in it, and for holding it actually in Morocco, a country that's very dear to my heart, where I spent many formative years of my life. I must admit I was a bit surprised when Jim Robinson shared with us his keynote address, and the title in particular, one that resonated with me quite a bit, partly for many reasons. One of them was the fact that the last plenary I think I participated in at the ERF annual meeting took place during the Arab Spring, sometime in 2011. I think I may have joined by video, or I was there in person, and the discussion at the time was about this incredible moment of hope and change, possibilities for transformation in the region. So a little over 10 years later, I'm here commenting on a title that essentially starts off with, why did the Arab Spring fail? That's the last thing one expected back then if I were to go back and just take a snapshot of how people in the room were looking, reacting, and speaking. But I did listen to what you've shared and the various interventions of my colleagues, and I just want to react with a quick set of remarks, of footnotes, qualifications, etc. The first thing I want to start off with is to maybe disagree with the title of Jim Robinson's talk. I think it's very fashionable to say and to claim and to write that the Arab Spring failed. That's what autocratic regimes and their allies in the West, foreign policy realists included, were for a very long time telling the region. Started in 2013-14. This thing has failed, move on. And I think it's important to kind of stop and ask the question, if it failed, how did it fail? And if it didn't, in what ways it didn't? I think at least we can agree, leaving this question aside for a moment, that the Arab Spring uprisings have been transformative. They've changed the region. Everything you see in the region today is partly accounted for with what happened in 2011 and 12. Domestic policies, regime crackdowns, democratic backsliding, autocratic consolidation, even regional politics has changed on account of the Arab Spring, suggesting, in fact, that the transformative effect is still unfolding, and with it will probably come another of other developments down the line. I think what I felt was missing from the very important keynote and the question that Jim raised, and this is where, again, I'm reflecting mostly on practice and observation as opposed to academic writing and real study of this. What was missing was the regional and international context. Everything happened within the Arab Spring without somehow, I'd say, adequate, serious attention to what was happening in the region, how the region reacted, and what was happening abroad. From that perspective, again, I'm going quickly through a set of remarks. In my at least humble reading of things, the Arab Spring took place at the wrong time. The world was not 1990. Global politics has changed. The US was retreating from the region. You had the emergence of new actors feeling very insecure, very uncertain, especially in the Gulf. The disastrous invasion of Iraq, disrupting the regional order. And all of this is a very quick way of saying that context matters. The transition in Eastern Europe partly succeeded because it was a very different context. It was the unipolar moment, the West had won. There were no challengers, everybody was interested. This was not the case in 2011 and 12. Not only that, I'd say the world, in many ways, starting with regional actors, but also international actors, conspired systematically to undermine and defeat the Arab Spring. They did. They walked away, or they aided and abetted forces and countries that had worked to undermine it. Why do I say this? And I could say a lot more, but I'm saying this because I think the notion of this important coalition that would work to oversee and shepherd the fragile transition really is key in what Jim said, and in partly that failure. To say that there were no coalitions that emerged, that groups did not come together to try and make this happen, would be unfair. To claim, however, that the work of these nascent coalitions, new actors that emerged on the space, was undermined constantly by interventions, co-optations, not necessarily always by local forces, but especially by regional and international actors, would be far more true. It is this polarization and the fragmentation of the initial new actors and the coalitions that emerged that, in my view, was at the heart of the inability to shepherd these transitions forward. In some countries, this led to civil wars, countries moving in the direction of partition. Think of Libya, think of Yemen. In other cases, it created enough uncertainty and fear and paranoia and fragmentation within the elites that were part of this transition so as to legitimize coups, legitimize crackdowns, legitimize violence by the very actors who were supposedly part of a transition to better governance and democracy. International context matters, regional context matters. I think this discussion is important, if only because we have not done a proper stock-taking exercise of what went wrong. We bought into this fallacy that the Arab Spring failed, it's over, regime stability, autocratic regime stability is here to stay. In fact, we actually bought into this fallacy in 2009-10, when it was very common to say, no change in the Arab world, these regimes are stable, they're strong, and yet we woke up in 2011 and 12 and saw change, profound change, surprising us. But in a context, I would argue, that made it difficult for these local domestic coalitions lacking experience to operate independently without constant interference, constant undermining by regional players and international players. I think this matters a lot for the kind of agendas moving forward. When we talk about whether it's democratization, good governance, improvements in development outcomes, a lot of this is going to require thinking through policy, thinking through the local context, but also taking the regional and the international context much more seriously. This, and I will end here, is going to be further complicated by what's happening now in the region. To think that Gaza is just going to be another blip in how the region reacts, in how people internalize information, and how people think about democracy, governance, our engagement with each other, our relationship with the West, is to make a grave mistake, in my view. Moving forward, discussions about climate change, local practices, and a host of other things are going to be clouded by how the region responds, how people internalize, and the accumulation of decades of engagement with the outside world. This perhaps is the one lesson I would have wanted to share with Jim and Timur and others for a very long time. And I was a participant in many of these discussions. Questions about what is wrong with the region, what went wrong with the region, always focused on the region, its culture, its tradition, its religion, its history. I say enough of this. If there's a lesson I've learned in the last 20 years, working very hard to build bridges, to understand and to work with others is, in many ways and for a very long time, at least for 200 years, we in the region have not been given a chance to work quietly, independently, autonomously on our issues by the outside world. It's time for the outside world to take responsibility, to show the real humility, real modesty. In fact, when it comes to Gaza, I want an apology for how they've conducted themselves. The people who've stood on the sideline and watched everything that is still happening before our eyes have no standing to come and lecture us on democracy, on good governance, on respect for human rights, and certainly not on climate change and the things that matter to them. These are just a few comments I wanted to share with you. Thank you for the time you gave me. I wanted to give us a space. Why would you want to step that? That's a different discussion.
Mr. Chairman, we need a mic.
These are all great presentations and comments, and we have now about, we started 10 minutes late, Shireen. So we have another 25 minutes.
Well, you don't want to miss out on Moroccan hospitality for coffee that's being scheduled from 11:30 to 12. It's your call, but I'm just telling you the rest of the schedule because the sessions, the parallel sessions will start at 12. So if you want to have another 10 minutes.
Fine. So, Jim, would you like to see anything before I open the floor?
Say a few remarks. Yes, go ahead. Yes. Okay, great. Great. Okay, let me just say a few things without talking too much. Like, just responding to Tariq, I think I'm often accused of ignoring geopolitics. You know, I think, like, whenever I've studied countries in detail, I've always become obsessed with the kind of internal dynamics, and I've always found these geopolitical explanations. You know, I worked for 30 years in Latin America. You know, I've always found these geopolitical explanations like never to be first order. You know, maybe this is a part of the world where I'm wrong, but just to say, you know, on your last remark, you know, exactly my point about a place like Botswana or Somaliland is because they had the breathing space without people interfering with them. Like, you know, what's the secret of Botswana? Botswana was never governed in Botswana during the colonial period by the British. It was governed from Mafeking and Vryburg in South Africa. The Swana people, you know, fought a 70-year battle to kind of maintain the sort of autonomy and viability of their traditional institutions and culture. And then they built the state themselves, you know. Same in Somaliland, you know, same in Somaliland. So I think that's sort of it, you know, so I really agree with that, you know, and that is a problem, you know, that kind of meddling. Let me say another couple of two things very fast. I did not say that democracy, and I do not believe for 1 second that democracy does not have instrumental value. Actually, I really disagree with that comment, that I think the evidence is overwhelming that democracy is associated with better public good provision and better economic performance. On average, that's the thing, on average. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and there's a lot of mechanisms that democratic transitions can kind of unleash clientelism, whatever, that are not good for public good provision. But on average, that democracy, and there's many reasons theoretically for thinking why that is. You know, you can't expect public goods to be provided at the whim of elites, you know. So they don't have an interest in it, you know, the people do. So I just wanted to kind of clarify my position on that. And I think just let me end by talking about democracy. You know, I think like, yeah, of course people want democracy. Democracy was invented in every society historically, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, you know, many Middle Eastern societies were intensely democratic historically. You know, if you wanted to ask me, you know, where does that come from? Think about human history. You know, it's deeply embedded in a history of egalitarianism of the human species. Now, what we can conjecture about ancestral human society is that it was very egalitarian. Like for me, you know, democracy is a sort of institutionalization of that egalitarianism. But I also think the fact of the matter is humans are very good at rationalizing hierarchy. You know, we're very good at living with hierarchy and rationalizing hierarchy. And most successful institutionalizations of democracy somehow make compromises with that. You know, the British case is, you know, and there's different reasons for that. One is exactly the reason that you were alluding to, Noha, which is that you have to make compromises to elites, to the security of elites, you have to get them to live with the system, you know. But I also, that's part of it, but I think part of it is also King Charles I touching lepers, you know, to cure them, which is that the origins of kingship are, you know, honestly to do with mediation between the supernatural world and the natural world. That's the fact of the matter. And, you know, that's you know, that's the origin of kingship in England, you know, the divine kingship in the Anglo-Saxon period. And so there are aspects of that, this hierarchy, you know, and the legitimacy of hierarchy, which are also very deeply rooted in human evolution from my perspective. So I think everyone, it's very natural to think that everyone aspires to democracy. The issue is how you institutionalize it in different cultural contexts. And I don't think there's one simple model of that. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, James. Okay, the floor is open, and I will take one, two, I'll take three at a time. One. Go ahead, Hassan. Yes. Noha, Hassan, Noha, and who's the third? Hold, okay, go ahead, Hassan. Yes, sir. Let's make it short.
Very short. A couple of observations. We have publicized it a lot that the fact that the Arab Spring was leaderless or headless, and the way the action of the movement was characterized. Judging right now that this is failed might be immature from my perspective. You need a second wave and third wave. Lastly, in 2020, during the COVID, I invited you for a talk, if you remember, a virtual one. And at the time, it was very much like these days. There was an election. And the question is the same prediction that you have basically talked about at the time, and it was very dramatic at the time by you. What do you expect it now for the U.S. Election?
Thank you, Hassan. Noha. Hiba, sorry, Hiba.
I want to make two statements very fast. One is that in my view, one of the dramatically democratization processes is via the SDGs in our part of the world. You just have to count who we're giving attention to, the bottom of our pyramid in terms of income, education, health, access to everything. And that brings me to my second point, which I'll mention tomorrow when I'm discussing, is the concept of localization, because we've heard it a few times, but I'm practicing it on the ground for the past 12 years. I'm in the 13th year. And just what it says in summary is if you want to institute and work on the SDGs, then do it through localization. Instead of working across the board with GDP per capita, whatever, everything's per capita, we have a fantastic poverty map, each and every one of our countries. So you start with those at the bottom of the pyramid. It's as simple as that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba. The third speaker.
Side presentations. I just wanted to raise a point with regard to Jim's presentation. You can hear me? Yes, I just wanted to raise a point with regard to creating a broad coalition. With regard to Egypt, I think in particular, A major reason for perhaps the failure of civil society was that, of course, the Mubarak regime was very successful in actually infiltrating that civil society before the Arab Spring. But then the other thing, of course, is that we had a lot of very strong politically connected firms and businessmen and women who were very much instrumental in ensuring that the previous status quo remained in power. So under these very extractive economic institutions, to borrow a phrase from your book, is there a role for political transformation that could eventually lead to economic inclusive institutions? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going the floor now. Well, let me just have the Jim and the rest of whoever is going to like to answer. Would you please answer these questions briefly as possible? Yeah, go ahead, start.
I mean, I find this perception that the Arab Spring, Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff, who negotiated the Northern Ireland peace agreement, he always says, you have to fail many times before you succeed. If you look at the history of Northern Ireland, there were many failed negotiations, from which people learned. People learned what would work, what didn't work, what resonated, what was possible, what was not possible, where do we start the agreement next time. So I think there's something in that, so I can imagine that that's true. I have to say I don't see it. For me, what I see in the region is the rise of successful illiberal regimes, and the sort of catastrophic collapse of the state in Yemen and Libya and Syria and Lebanon, and but you know more than I do. You know more than I do about society. There's a very interesting Egyptian anthropologist whose name I'm blanking on, who teaches in Illinois, I think, who's written about this kind of micro change in the culture and the society. So I think that's interesting, and I can imagine a world where that's true. Probably my knowledge isn't deep enough to speak to that. I'm certainly not going to talk about the U.S. election. I mean, I think Heba, your comment is sort of in that similar vein, that there is a kind of tectonic transformation at a local level in terms of people's organization, and I think that's very exciting. But I probably don't know enough. I don't know enough about it to really comment on that. And I think that the last comment, you're suggesting a kind of different hypothesis, which is actually, it was the nature of the extractive regime that made the transition very, very different. So it's not so much the civil society, it's the way the extractive institutions were organized, that made it very difficult to make this transition. And that may also be a very interesting source of variation that makes it different from many of the success stories that we looked at in the book. Yeah.
You have anything to say?
Just on the last point, maybe we need to also dig a little bit deeper, not only in the mechanisms of extraction by the regime, but what is it that is being actually extracted to start with? The region has very, as we all know from earlier on, a very strong narrative of rentier assets, not productive assets. And now, to link that to Tariq's very potent point about the regional and the international context, I want to give you a message of warning. The region's asset has always been considered, the rentier asset has always been considered oil so far, and gas to some extent. Well, as violence increases around the world, also between the US and China, the geographical location of this region becomes yet another rentier asset, which is another curse that this region has. So you go from the assets of land, capital, and technology, all the way up to the asset of your geographical location in a volatile world. And then you have a curse of big magnitude.
Thank you. Briefly, Wissam, please.
Thanks. I want to say one thing. I think one of the reasons why we have a bit of a crisis in our region is that there is also a disconnect between the thinkers and the policymakers. So that link between the one who study what's happening in societies, the one who study what's happening, you know, in the macroeconomic scheme and so on, and the ones who make the policy. And I think this is where, again, development partners, organizations, research networks like ERF can actually bridge that gap between how to translate the knowledge that's being generated into policies that actually inform. Because this disconnect will continue to keep us actually, you know, backwards. And I want to build on the point that Khalid made at the end about, Tariq, sorry, made at the end about the stock taking, the Southern-led stock taking exercise about what lessons have we learned from the past, how do we take them on to the future. It's not going to happen by policymakers. It's going to happen by civil society, civil actors, by bringing to light examples that are working at the local level that can actually demonstrate that by scaling such local successes, that actually change can progress.
Thank you. Carl.
Thank you very much. Very, very quickly, just to be in line with the comments on the scale of the analysis to talk about the failure or success of changing the regime. And when I was alluded to the third phase of backlash or erosion of democracy, it was not specific indeed this phase to the region. We observe that in every region, every continent, and in every region in major countries. First point. The second point, indeed, as a French, I won't say that change of regime is done in one day. I mean, 10 years after the French Revolution, I won't say where we were, but certainly not in a stable parliamentarian democracy. I think we had 2 restorations, 3 empire, 5 republics. So timeline is important indeed. Geopolitical, yes, I totally agree with Noah's comments. When we are more and more, I mean, when we talk about the evolution of the structure of the economy, your geopolitical position, your geography, the geography does matter. We are talking about industrialization and nearshoring in certain regions. No, some of the debate is coming to friendshoring and in the localization of the global value chain. So this is becoming quite important. And last comment, yes, the social contract, where we are talking about to inclusive regime. I also agree with you that it will come from the local communities, acknowledging local knowledge and local fabric of deliberation to achieve the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Do I have to say something? I have to? Okay. Yeah, so maybe just to end on a positive note, I think, and again, you're right, Jim, the starting point for my own intervention was geopolitics in the region and abroad. I didn't think I would be here talking about that, nor did I think a decade ago that these will prove to be, in many ways, very decisive factors in how the region will evolve. But in my view, they have. And in fact, they're responsible also for what we're looking at in the region. And so just by way of thinking about solving the problem, we do need a functioning regional geopolitical order, an order where countries feel safe, secure, because only then will they cooperate. The existing formula for that, or the formula that the US and some of its European allies have been pushing in the last 10 years, is not working. It's a formula that works as follows. Stability and peace and prosperity will come in the region, with the Arabs normalizing with Israel on the one hand, with Iran being cornered and isolated on the other hand, and with Turkey being excluded and marginalized at the very end. That order is not going to work. The pursuit of this formula through various initiatives we've seen has failed. And I think Gaza is the biggest testimony for why we are where we are today. So thinking positively about how to address this, I think post the conflict in Gaza will be important. Maybe 30 seconds by way of responding positively again to Jim. I do agree with you, the rise of illiberal developmental states in parts of the region here is fascinating. These countries are incredibly confident, ambitious, they have resources. they're not only trying to change the rest of the Arab world, they're actually trying to change the rest of the world. They're doing so in Africa increasingly. But the bet on autocracies elsewhere in the region to survive, to stay the course, to remain stable, to continue to deliver for their backers and sponsors abroad the way they delivered stability pre-Arab Spring, I think is a wrong bet. It's a bad bet. It's not going to work. Who conceived of this and saw it a long time ago, better than me and you? It's the British group you cited in your talk, The Who. My favorite song from that group was Eminence Front. It's an eminence front. It's a Quran. It's a bunch of bullshit. And it's going to collapse at some point.
Two more questions.
We're running into, there wouldn't be time for coffee.
So you want me to end? Well, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.